Some people are not forgotten. They are simply never seen. The Whitmore estate stood silent beneath a sky the color of cold steel, its tall windows dim with candlelight that never quite reached the corners where shadows lived, and in those shadows, she moved. Elena Whitmore carried a tray across the marble floor, her steps soundless, measured, practiced the way one learns to exist without drawing breath too loudly, without reminding the world they are there. The silver rattled faintly as she set it down beside a lady who did not look at her, did not thank her, did not even pause her conversation, as if the hands that served her were invisible, as if the girl herself had already faded into the walls. It had been this way for years, long enough that even Elena no longer expected anything different. She did not speak unless spoken to, and even then her voice remained soft, careful, like something that might break if pressed too hard. She was not a servant, not truly, but she was not family either. A distant name attached to the house, a quiet obligation tucked out of sight like old furniture no one wished to throw away, but no one wished to see. The laughter in the room swelled around her, rising and falling like waves that never reached the shore where she stood. And so she turned away, as she always did, retreating into the corridor where the air was colder, where the stone walls seemed to breathe a quiet loneliness that matched her own. Upstairs a door creaked open, and she paused just for a second, long enough to hear footsteps, unfamiliar, heavier than the soft rhythm of the household. Something in them carried weight, not just of presence, but of authority, and without meaning to, she looked up as he entered. Duke Alexander Blackwood filled the doorway, not with noise, but with stillness. His coat still dusted from the road, his expression unreadable, his gaze sweeping the hall like a man who had long ago stopped expecting warmth from the places he returned to. Servants' bowed voices hushed. The entire house seemed to hold its breath, and yet somehow in that brief, suspended moment his eyes did not land on the grand staircase or the polished floors or the carefully arranged faces waiting to greet him. They moved past all of it and stopped on her. Elena froze, not from fear, but from something far more unfamiliar, the sensation of being seen, truly seen, as if for the first time in years she occupied space in someone's world. His gaze lingered only a second before shifting away, but it was enough to unsettle something deep within her, enough to make her heart move in a way it had forgotten how. And as the house resumed its careful rhythm around him, as voices returned and footsteps continued, Elena lowered her eyes once more, stepping back into the shadow where she belonged. But something had already changed, something small and quiet, like the first crack in ice that had long remained unbroken. And somewhere behind her, without turning, without calling her name, the Duke spoke a single question to no one in particular, and yet it felt like it had been meant only for her. Why does no one speak to that girl? The question did not echo through the hall, but it lingered in the silence that followed, like something misplaced that no one dared to pick up. A few glances were exchanged, subtle, careful, as if even acknowledging the girl might grant her more presence than she was meant to have. The housekeeper was the first to respond, her voice smooth, practiced. Your Grace, she is merely a distant relation, nothing of importance. The words settled quickly, neatly, as though they had been prepared long ago for this exact moment. Alexander said nothing. His gaze had already shifted, but something in his stillness suggested the answer had not satisfied him. Not entirely. Elena remained where she was, her hands folded lightly before her, eyes lowered once more, as if the moment had never happened, as if she had not felt the weight of his attention rest on her for that brief, impossible second. The evening continued with its usual rhythm. Dinner was served, conversations resumed, laughter rose and fell, but something had altered in the spaces between each sound, something unseen, yet undeniable. Later, as the candles burned lower and the corridors grew quiet, Elena moved again through the house, gathering what had been left behind: a forgotten glass, a folded napkin, a chair slightly out of place, small things that required no recognition. She worked alone, as she always did, her footsteps soft against the polished floor, until she entered the library and paused. The fire had nearly gone out, leaving only a faint glow that flickered against the tall shelves, and there by the window stood the Duke, his silhouette unmoving, framed by the dark beyond the glass. She lowered her gaze instinctively, stepping back. I apologize, Your Grace. I did not realize the room was occupied. Her voice was calm even, but he did not turn immediately, as if he had known she would come, as if he had been waiting for something. He could not name you. Walk as though the house does not belong to you, he said at last, his voice low, steady. The words caught her off guard, not because of their tone, but because they were directed at her. She hesitated only briefly before answering. It does not, Your Grace. The truth was simple, offered without bitterness, without expectation. He turned, then slowly, his eyes finding her once more, not passing over her, not dismissing her, but holding her in a way that made the air feel different, heavier somehow. "Why does no one speak to you?" he asked again, this time not to the room, not to the silence, but to her directly. Elena felt something tighten within her chest. Not fear, not quite. She chose her words carefully. "Because there is nothing to say," she replied, her voice quiet but certain. For a moment neither of them moved. The fire shifted behind him, casting a faint light across his face, revealing something sharper in his expression, something that did not belong to indifference. He studied her, as if weighing something unseen, as if searching for an answer that had not yet been given. And then, without warning, he stepped closer, not enough to threaten, not enough to break the careful distance she had always maintained, but enough that she could no longer pretend he had not noticed her. "You are wrong," he said softly, almost to himself, before turning away, leaving the words suspended between them as Elena stood there alone. Once more, but no longer entirely invisible, and for the first time in years the silence did not feel empty. It felt like something waiting to be broken. Morning arrived without announcement, as it always did, pale light slipping through tall windows that illuminated dust in the air, but never quite reached the corners where she worked. Elena moved through the eastern corridor, carrying fresh linens. Her steps measured her presence unnoticed, yet something within her had shifted, not enough to change her movements, not enough to draw attention, but enough that the silence no longer felt entirely empty. His words from the night before lingered, not loud, not demanding, but persistent, like a question left unanswered. "You are wrong." She had repeated them to herself more than once, though she did not know why. No one had ever suggested otherwise. No one had ever implied that her existence held weight beyond quiet obligation. And yet he had said it without hesitation, without doubt, as though it were fact. She reached the study door and paused, hearing voices within. The housekeeper again, and another servant. Their tones hushed, but not enough to disappear entirely. "His Grace has taken an interest," the servant murmured uncertainly. "And that is precisely what must not happen," the housekeeper replied quickly, firmly. "She is not meant for notice. You understand." That there was a pause, a quiet agreement, and then footsteps moving away. Elena remained still, her fingers tightening slightly around the folded linen, not in anger, not even in hurt, but in something more fragile, the confirmation of what she had always known, spoken aloud as instruction. She was not meant to be seen. She waited until the corridor fell silent before entering the study, placing the linens exactly where they belonged, smoothing each edge until nothing remained out of place. The routine grounded her, restored the order she had always relied upon. And yet, as she turned to leave, she felt it again, that subtle awareness that she was no longer entirely alone. He stood by the window. Once more, though, she had not heard him enter the room, his presence quiet, but unmistakable, as if the space itself had shifted to accommodate him. She lowered her gaze, instinctively stepping aside. "I did not expect you here, Your Grace," she said softly. "You rarely expect anything," he replied, and there was something in his voice, not unkind, but not indifferent either. She hesitated, unsure whether a response was required or permitted. "I have learned not to," she answered finally, the truth again, simple, unadorned. He studied her for a moment longer, his eyes not passing over her, but resting, as though committing something to memory. "And yet you remain," he said quietly, not a question, but an observation. Elena did not know how to answer that she had remained, because there had never been another choice, because leaving required a place to go and she had never been given one, because disappearing slowly had seemed easier than facing a world that had already decided she did not belong anywhere. But she did not say any of this. Instead, she inclined her head slightly, as if acknowledging a statement that required no reply. His gaze shifted briefly to the neatly arranged linens, then back to her. "You do not make mistakes," he said. She blinked once, caught off guard by the remark. "I try not to." He stepped closer, then not enough to close the distance completely, but enough that the air between them felt different, charged with something she could not name. "That is not the same thing," he said softly, and for a moment she met his eyes before she could stop herself. And in that brief, unguarded second, something passed between them, something quiet, but undeniable, recognition, not of position or duty, but of existence, as if for the first time in her life someone was not looking through her, but at her. And then, just as quickly, she lowered her gaze again, retreating into the safety of invisibility. But the moment did not disappear. It lingered in the space around them like a breath held too long. And as she turned to leave, his voice followed her, not loud, not commanding, But certain Elena, the sound of her name spoken, without hesitation, without dismissal, stopped her completely, because it had been years since anyone had chosen to say it, and she realized then, with a quiet certainty that frightened her more than anything else, that he had not asked for her name. He had known it all along. Her name did not fade after he spoke it. It remained in the air between them, as if the walls themselves had heard it and refused to let it disappear. Elena stood still for a moment longer than she should have, her fingers tightening slightly at her sides, not out of fear, but from something far more unfamiliar, recognition, the simple, undeniable truth that she had been acknowledged, and she did not know what to do with it. She turned slowly, her gaze lowered as it had always been, but something in her posture had shifted, not visible to anyone else perhaps, but to him it was enough. "You should not say my name, Your Grace," she said quietly, the words careful, chosen with the same precision she applied to everything in her life. His expression did not change, but there was a faint narrowing of his eyes, as if he had expected resistance, but not the reason behind it. "Why not?" he asked, the question direct, unembellished, as though the answer should be obvious. Elena hesitated, not because she lacked the answer, but because speaking it aloud felt like breaking an unspoken rule that had governed her existence for years. "Because it draws attention," she replied finally, "and attention is not something I am meant to have." The silence that followed was not empty, it was measured. His gaze remained on her, steady, unwavering, as though he were examining something delicate and easily overlooked. "You are not meant," he repeated slowly, the words tasting unfamiliar, as if he did not accept them as truth. And who decided that she did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because the answer was too simple, too ingrained to feel like a decision at all. "Everyone," she said at last, her voice calm, without bitterness, without accusation. "Just fact." He studied her then longer than before, and something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that the air between them felt different, as though something unseen had begun to move beneath the surface. "You speak as though you agreed with them," he said quietly. Elena lowered her gaze again, because it was easier, because it was safer, because meeting his eyes felt like stepping into something she did not understand. Agreement was never required, she answered softly. It was simply expected. Another silence stretched between them, but this one held tension, not discomfort, but something sharper, something that did not belong to her world. He turned slightly, his attention shifting toward the window, but his voice remained directed at her. "Expectations can be wrong," he said, and there was something in the way he spoke the words that suggested he was not speaking only of her. Elena felt something stir within her at that, not hope, not yet, but something close to it, something fragile and uncertain that she did not know how to hold. "I would not presume to challenge them," she said, her voice steady though quieter now. He turned back to her, then fully this time, and for the first time there was something unmistakable in his gaze, not curiosity, not indifference, but resolve. "Then you will not," he said calmly, the certainty in his tone leaving no room for argument. Elena blinked, once caught off guard, not by the words themselves, but by the quiet authority behind them, as if he had already decided something she had not yet understood. "You will not need to," he added more softly, and for a moment neither of them moved, the space between them filled with something unspoken, something that did not belong to the rules she had lived by for so long. And as she stood there, her name still echoing faintly in her mind, she realized with a quiet, unsettling clarity that the world she had learned to disappear within might not remain unchanged for much longer, because for reasons she could not yet comprehend the Duke had begun to see her, and he did not seem willing to look away. The change did not arrive like a storm. It came quietly, almost imperceptibly woven into the ordinary rhythm of the house. Yet once it began, it could not be undone. Elena noticed it first in the smallest details, the kind most would overlook, but she had been trained by years of silence to recognize even the slightest shift in pattern. The morning trays were no longer left entirely for her to collect. A footman now carried half the burden without being told. The housekeeper, who once dismissed her presence, now paused briefly when giving instructions, as if measuring her words more carefully, as if aware that someone might be listening. Elena did not ask why. She did not need to. She understood the nature of change in places like this. It did not happen by accident. It was directed, unseen, deliberate, and there was only one person within these walls who held that kind of quiet authority. She moved through the corridors as she always had, her steps soft, her presence restrained, but now there were moments, brief and fleeting, when the air around her felt different, as if it carried an awareness that had not existed before she passed two maids whispering near the staircase, their voices dropping the moment she approached, not out of cruelty, but caution, and though they did not greet her, they no longer ignored her. Completely, their eyes flickered toward her, then away, as if unsure of what was permitted and what was not. Elena continued on, without pause, her hands steady, her expression unchanged, but inside something unfamiliar stirred, not comfort, not yet, but something close to it, something uncertain, that she did not trust enough to name. Later that afternoon, she entered the West sitting room, carrying a small stack of books returned from the library. She had not been asked to bring them, but she had noticed they were missing from their place, and it had felt wrong to leave them, so she corrected it as she always did, restoring order where no one else thought to look. As she placed the final book on the shelf, she sensed it again, that quiet shift in the room. Before she even turned, he was there, not standing at the door this time, not observing from a distance, but already inside, already aware. She lowered her gaze instinctively, though her movements did not falter. "You notice everything," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made the words feel deliberate. Elena hesitated briefly before answering. "It is easier to remain unseen when nothing is out of place," she replied, her tone even as though the statement required no further explanation. He stepped closer, not abruptly, not in a way that demanded attention, but with a quiet certainty that altered the space between them. "That is not why you do it," he said, and there was no question in his voice, only quiet understanding. Elena felt her breath catch for just a moment, not enough to be noticed, but enough that she became aware of it herself. No one had ever suggested there was a reason beyond necessity. No one had ever looked beyond the surface of what she did, and yet he spoke as if he had already seen the truth beneath it. She did not respond, because she did not know how. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could feel the presence of him, without needing to look up. "You fix what others ignore," he continued more quietly now, and for a moment there was something in his tone, something that did not belong to observation, but to recognition. Elena's fingers tightened slightly at her sides, the words settling deeper than they should have, because they were not entirely about the room or the misplaced books. They were about her, and for the first time she understood that he was not simply noticing her actions, he was seeing her. The thought unsettled her more than anything else, because it changed the balance of everything she had known. "I only do what is necessary," she said finally, her voice softer than before. He did not move, but his gaze remained steady. "Necessary is not the same as insignificant," he replied, and the quiet certainty in his words left no space for dismissal. Elena lowered her eyes again, retreating into the familiar safety of silence, but the words lingered, echoing in a place she had long kept closed, and as she turned to leave, she felt it once more, that shift, that presence, that refusal to let her disappear completely. And though she did not look back, she knew with a certainty that both steadied and unsettled her, that he was still watching, not to judge, not to dismiss, but because for reasons she could not yet understand he had chosen to see her. And he was not stopping. The house did not speak of changes, but it began to move differently, as if an unseen hand had adjusted its rhythm just enough to unsettle those who knew it too well. Elena felt it most in the spaces where silence used to be complete. Now there were pauses where voices lowered when she passed, moments where conversations shifted direction, as though her presence required acknowledgement, even if no one dared to give it openly. She did not seek the reason, she already knew where it began. The Duke had not spoken to her again since the sitting room, but his absence was not the same as before. It was not indifference, it was distance, chosen not by neglect, but by restraint, as though he were allowing something to unfold without interference. And yet his influence remained undeniable. That evening, Elena entered the dining hall after the guests had retired, her task simple as always, to restore order where excess had been left behind. Glasses half filled, chairs, slightly misaligned, silverware disturbed by careless hands. She moved through it with quiet precision, correcting each detail until the room returned to stillness. It was in this stillness that she noticed something unusual. A chair at the far end of the table had been left slightly pulled back, not in disorder, but as if intentionally placed. She paused for a moment, her gaze lingering on it, before she stepped forward to adjust it, as she always would. But before her hand reached it, his voice stopped her. "Leave it." Elena did not turn immediately, her hand hovering just above the carved wood before she slowly withdrew it and lowered her gaze. "Yes, Your Grace," she said softly. He stood near the doorway, not entering fully, not imposing, yet his presence filled the space more than any movement. Why do you always erase yourself? He asked the question quiet, but carrying a weight that settled deep within her. Elena remained still, the words unfamiliar, not because she did not understand them, but because no one had ever framed her existence in that way before. I maintain what is required, she answered after a moment, her voice calm. Measured the response she had given all her life. He took a step forward, not enough to close the distance, but enough to make the question feel closer, more personal. That is not what I asked, he said gently, and for the first time there was something in his tone that was not observation, but challenge, not harsh, not demanding, but undeniable. Elena felt it. Then the subtle shift beneath her carefully built composure, the fragile balance she had maintained for years beginning to move, and she did not know how to steady it. Because it is easier, she said finally, the truth slipping through before she could stop it. Easier than what? He asked. Easier than being noticed, she replied, and though her voice remained steady, there was something quieter beneath it, something that had not been meant to be heard. He studied her then longer than before, his gaze not searching now, but understanding, as if the answer had confirmed something he had already begun to see. And then he did something unexpected. He did not argue. He did not correct her. He simply moved to the chair she had almost adjusted, and with deliberate care, he pushed it slightly farther back, not returning it to order, but altering it in a way that made its presence impossible to ignore. Elena watched the movement without lifting her gaze fully, her breath catching just slightly as the meaning settled in the room. Will not fall apart if one thing remains out of place, he said quietly, and the words were not about the chair. She understood that much now. They were about her, about the space she occupied, about the idea that her existence did not need to be corrected, hidden, or erased to maintain balance. She stood there in the quiet that followed the untouched chair between them, like a question left unanswered, and for the first time she did not move to fix it. She did not step forward to restore the order she had always been responsible for. Instead, she remained exactly where she was, and though it was a small stillness, almost invisible to anyone else, it felt like something far greater, like the beginning of a choice she had never been allowed to make before. And as the silence settled around them, once more she realized with a quiet certainty that unsettled her more than anything else that he was not simply changing the house, he was changing her place within it. And he was doing it without asking her permission. The chair remained where he had left it, untouched, unmoved, a quiet defiance against the order Elena had upheld for years. And though no one spoke of it, the absence of correction lingered in the room, like a subtle disturbance that could not be ignored. The next morning, she passed through the dining hall, as she always did, her steps steady, her expression composed, but her eyes did not fall on the chair. Immediately she avoided it at first, as if acknowledging it would require something she was not yet ready to give. Yet, as she moved closer, her gaze shifted almost against her will, and there it was, still out of place, still present, a small detail that refused to be erased. She paused, not long enough to draw attention, but long enough to feel the weight of it, the choice it represented. She could fix it, restore the balance, return everything to what it had been before, or she could leave it, as it was, a quiet acceptance of something new, something uncertain. Her fingers tightened slightly at her sides, as the familiar instinct urged her forward, but she did not move. She let the moment pass, and continued on, leaving the chair exactly as it was. Throughout the day, she became aware of it, not the chair itself, but the way it changed the house. The servants noticed, of course, they always noticed everything, though they rarely spoke of it openly. A maid hesitated near the doorway, her eyes flickering toward the table, before quickly looking away. A footman adjusted the silverware, but left the chair untouched, as if unsure whether he was allowed to correct it. The uncertainty spread, subtle but undeniable, and Elena felt it with every step she took, not as pressure, but as awareness, as if the space she occupied had begun to shift beneath her feet. Later that afternoon, she found herself in the garden, a place she rarely visited, not because she was forbidden, but because it had never felt like a space meant for her. The paths were carefully maintained, the flowers arranged with deliberate beauty, yet there was a stillness there that felt different from the quiet of the house. It was not empty, it was waiting. She moved along the edge of the path, her gaze lowered, her presence as unobtrusive as ever, until she heard the sound of footsteps behind her, not hurried, not unexpected, simply there. She did not turn immediately. She did not need to. She had already begun to recognize the weight of his presence, the way the air seemed to settle when he was near. You chose not to move it, he said, his voice calm, carrying easily through the open space. Elena's breath stilled for a moment before she answered, "Yes, Your Grace." She kept her gaze lowered, though she was aware of him standing, just a few feet away, not close enough to intrude, but close enough that the distance felt intentional. Why, she asked herself the same question more than once since the night before, and yet the answer felt difficult to form, not because it was complicated, but because it required her to acknowledge something she had never allowed herself to consider before. "I do not know," she admitted quietly, and the truth of it felt unfamiliar on her tongue. He did not respond immediately, and in that pause, she felt something shift again, not outside of her, but within her, as if the simple act of not knowing had opened a space she had never needed to fill before. "You." "Well," he said finally, his voice softer now, not instructing, not demanding, but certain. Elena felt something tighten in her chest, not fear, not resistance, but anticipation, something she did not understand and did not yet trust. She lifted her gaze then, just slightly, not enough to meet his eyes fully, but enough to see him standing there watching her, not as one observes a servant, not as one acknowledges an obligation, but as one waits for something important, something worth seeing. And in that moment she realized that the change she had felt was no longer confined to the house or the space around her. It had begun to take root within her as well, and though she did not yet know what it would become, she understood one thing with a clarity that left no room for doubt. He was not waiting for her to return to what she had been. He was waiting for her to become something else. The garden did not feel the same after that moment. It no longer felt like a place she passed through unnoticed. It felt like a place that remembered that she had stood there, that she had been seen. Elena returned to the house before the light began to fade. Her steps measured, her expression composed. Yet something beneath the surface had shifted in a way she could not fully contain. The corridors seemed narrower, the silence less certain, as if the walls themselves had begun to listen. When she moved past the servants, they no longer looked entirely through her. Their eyes flickered, hesitated, lingered just long enough to acknowledge her presence before quickly turning away. It was not respect, not yet, but it was no longer absence, and that alone unsettled her more than anything else. She entered the small room that had been given to her years ago, a space tucked at the far end of the upper floor where the ceilings sloped slightly and the windows let in only a narrow stretch of light. It had always been enough. She had never expected more. The bed was neatly made, the single chair placed precisely where it had always been, the small table cleared of any unnecessary object, nothing out of place, nothing to draw attention. She moved to the window, her fingers resting lightly against the cool glass as she looked out over the grounds. The garden where she had stood earlier, now distant, quiet, untouched by the thoughts that still lingered within her. Well, she had not understood his words at first, not fully, but now they echoed differently, not as a statement of certainty, but as something that required her participation, something she would have to choose. And that was what unsettled her most. The idea of choice had never been part of her existence before. There had only been expectation, routine, silence, a life shaped by what was required of her, not by what she might want. She closed her eyes briefly, as if that might quiet the unfamiliar feeling rising within her, but it did not. It remained steady, persistent, like a question that refused to be ignored. A soft knock at her door broke the silence. She turned slowly, her posture instinctively returning to its usual composure. "Enter," she said quietly. The door opened just enough for the housekeeper to step inside, her expression as composed as ever, but there was something different in her gaze now, something cautious, measured. "Miss Whitmore," she said, her tone formal, but lacking its usual dismissal. "His Grace has made an adjustment to the household assignments." Elena did not move. She did not speak. She simply waited. "Please ensure that you are present in the West Wing tomorrow morning," the housekeeper continued, her words precise, deliberate. There was a brief pause, as if she expected a reaction, but none came. "As you wish," Elena replied, her voice calm, though something beneath it had begun to shift. The housekeeper inclined her head slightly, then turned to leave, but hesitated just before reaching the door. "It would be wise," she added quietly, not looking back, "to be mindful of your position." Elena stood still, her gaze steady, though the words settled heavily within the room. "My position," she repeated softly, but the housekeeper did not answer. She left without another word, the door closing gently behind her, leaving the silence to return. Elena remained where she was for a long moment, her eyes drifting once more toward the window, toward the fading light beyond the glass. She understood the warning. She had always understood it better than anyone, but now it felt different. Now it felt incomplete, as if it no longer held the same certainty it once had, because something had changed, something she could not yet name, something that had begun the moment he chose to see her, and had not stopped since. She lowered her gaze slowly, her fingers tightening slightly against the fabric of her sleeve, as the thoughts settled in quiet and undeniable. She had been taught how to disappear, but no one had ever taught her what to do when someone refused to let her. The West Wing had always been a place she avoided, not by instruction, but by instinct. It belonged to the part of the house where presence mattered, where voices carried and names were spoken freely. Elena arrived early before the morning light had fully settled across the tall windows, her steps quieter than usual, as if the unfamiliar space required greater caution. The air felt different here, less forgiving, less willing to let things pass unnoticed. She paused just inside the doorway, her gaze lowered as she took in the room. The furniture polished, the curtains drawn back to allow in pale light, everything in its proper place. Yet unlike the rest of the house, this room felt occupied, even in silence, as if it expected to be used, not merely maintained. She moved forward slowly, her hands clasped lightly before her, unsure for the first time in years of what was required of her here. The usual tasks were absent. There was nothing to fix, nothing to restore, nothing out of place. And that absence left her unsteady. What am I to do? She asked quietly, though no one had given her instruction. The question felt necessary now, because for the first time, she could not rely on routine to guide her. You are to remain. The voice came from behind her, calm, familiar. She did not startle, but her breath stilled as she turned slightly, not fully, not. Yet he stood near the entrance, not watching the room, not inspecting the space, but looking at her. Elena lowered her gaze immediately. Yes, Your Grace, she replied, though the answer did not settle the uncertainty within her remain. He repeated, stepping forward, his movements unhurried, deliberate, as if the space between them was something to be considered, not crossed without thought. Elena felt the word differently the second time, not as instruction, but as something heavier, something that carried meaning beyond the surface. She had always remained, that had never been in question, but this felt different, this felt chosen. She stood still, waiting for clarification, but none came. Instead, he moved to the window, his gaze shifting briefly to the grounds beyond before returning to her. The housekeeper will give you tasks if they are necessary, he said, but his tone suggested otherwise. Elena hesitated, then asked the question that had begun to form the moment she entered. Why am I here? It was not defiance, it was not challenge, it was simple truth. She did not understand, and for the first time she allowed herself to say it aloud. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but measured, as if he considered the answer carefully before giving it. Because you should be, he said at last, the words quiet but certain. Elena felt something shift again, that same unfamiliar sensation that had begun to follow her through the house, something that made the ground beneath her feel less fixed, as if the place she occupied was no longer defined by what she did, but by something else entirely. She lowered her gaze further, her fingers tightening slightly at her sides. That is not how this house works, she said softly, the statement more to herself than to him. He did not correct her immediately. He simply watched her, as if waiting for something deeper than the words themselves. Perhaps that is the problem, he replied, and there was something in his voice now, something sharper, not directed at her, but at the idea she had spoken. Elena felt the weight of that settle between them, not as accusation, but as possibility, a shift that extended beyond her, beyond the room, beyond the quiet structure she had lived within for so long. She stood there, unsure of where to place herself, without the guidance of routine, without the comfort of invisibility, and for the first time, she understood the warning the housekeeper had given her, not as a threat, but as a truth. Her position was changing, whether she accepted it or not, and she did not know what would happen if she did not hold on to the only thing she had ever known. And yet, as she stood there in the West Wing, where presence could not be ignored, she realized something else. Just as clearly, she was no longer being allowed to disappear, and she did not yet know how to exist any other way. Time did not move the same way in the West Wing. It stretched and settled in unfamiliar patterns, leaving Elena aware of every second that passed, without instruction, without purpose, without the quiet certainty she had relied upon for years. She remained where she had been told, near the window, her hands lightly clasped, her posture composed, yet beneath that stillness something restless had begun to take shape. The absence of tasks left space for thought, and thought was something she had learned to avoid because it led to questions, and questions led to things she could not afford to consider. The Duke did not leave immediately. He remained in the room, moving only occasionally, his presence steady, not intrusive, but impossible to ignore. He did not watch her constantly, yet she felt the awareness of him as one feels the presence of light, even with closed eyes. It existed, whether acknowledged or not. After some time, he spoke again, not to instruct, not to correct, but simply to break the silence. You are uncomfortable. Elena did not deny it, because there was no reason to, and because he would see through it regardless. Yes, Your Grace, she answered, her voice, even though the truth carried more weight than she allowed him to hear. Why, he asked, and the question lingered longer than it should have, because it required something she had never been asked: to give an explanation of her own state of being. She hesitated, then chose honesty, because anything less felt unnecessary now. I do not know what is expected of me, she said. Quietly, the words measured, but real. He considered that for a moment, then stepped closer, not enough to force proximity, but enough to shift the distance into something intentional. Nothing, he said simply. Elena's breath stilled, not from confusion, but from the unfamiliar nature of the answer. Nothing, she repeated softly, as if testing the word, as if it might change meaning when spoken aloud. Yes, he replied, his gaze steady on her. You are not here to serve a function today. You are here because I asked it of you. The words settled into the room, altering its shape, altering hers in a way she could not ignore. She lowered her gaze further, her fingers tightening slightly at the fabric of her sleeve. That is not how I have ever been placed anywhere, she said, her voice quieter now, not resistant, but uncertain. He did not respond immediately, and in that pause, she felt something deeper than before, something that reached beyond the walls of the room, beyond the structure of the house itself. Then perhaps it is time that changed, he said finally, and there was no force in his tone, no command, only quiet certainty. Elena felt the weight of that press against everything she had known. The idea of existing without purpose, without defined necessity, unsettled her more than any demand ever had, because it required her to occupy space without justification, something she had never been permitted to do. She remained still, her gaze lowered, yet her thoughts no longer silent, no longer contained within the boundaries she had built for them. What if I fail, she asked before she could stop herself, the question slipping through not as fear of duty, but as something far more personal. He did not hesitate. You will, he said calmly, and before she could interpret the words as criticism, he continued, it is the only way you will learn that failure does not erase you. Elena's breath caught slightly at that, not because of the words themselves, but because of what they implied, the idea that she could exist beyond success or failure, beyond usefulness or invisibility. She had never considered it before, had never needed to, and yet now it stood before her like a path she did not know how to walk. She lifted her gaze, then just enough to meet his eyes for a brief moment, and in that moment, she saw something she had not expected: not authority, not distance, but patience, as if he were willing to wait for her to understand something he already knew. And as she lowered her gaze once more, she realized with quiet certainty that this was no longer about the house or the tasks or the role she had played for years. This was about something far more difficult, something that required her to face a truth she had avoided for most of her life. She had never been nothing, she had only been treated as though she was, and now for the first time someone had removed that illusion and left her standing in its absence, unsure of who she was. Without it, the silence that followed his words did not settle, it deepened, stretching between them in a way that made it impossible for Elena to retreat into the familiar patterns she had relied on for so long. She remained near the window, her posture still composed, yet something within her had begun to shift in ways she could no longer ignore. The idea that she had never been nothing lingered in her thoughts, not as comfort, but as disruption, as if the foundation of everything she understood about herself had been quietly removed, leaving her uncertain where to stand. She lowered her gaze once more, not out of habit this time, but because meeting his eyes felt like stepping too far into something she was not ready to face. I do not know how to be anything else, she said softly, the admission quiet but unguarded. It was not meant to be spoken aloud, yet it remained between them undeniable. He did not answer immediately, and in that pause, she felt the weight of his attention, not pressing, not demanding, but present, as if he were allowing her the space to confront the truth of her own words before offering anything in return. You were not meant to remain what they decided you should be, he said at last, his voice calm, yet carrying a certainty that unsettled her more than doubt ever could. Elena's fingers tightened slightly at her sides, the words striking deeper than she expected, because they suggested something she had never considered, that what she had become was not inevitable, but imposed, that the silence she had lived within was not natural, but constructed, and that realization shifted something inside her, not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to make it impossible to return to what had been before. She drew a slow breath, steadying herself against the unfamiliar weight of it. And yet they never asked if I agreed. She said, her voice quiet, but no longer entirely detached. He studied her, then his gaze unwavering. They did not need your agreement, he replied softly. They only needed your silence. The truth of that settled heavily within her, not as accusation, but as clarity. She had not been erased because she had failed to exist. She had been erased because she had never been allowed to speak. She turned her gaze toward the window again, her reflection faint against the glass, barely visible in the shifting light. For years, she had accepted that reflection as truth, as proof of her place in the world, something indistinct, something easily overlooked. But now it felt different. Now it felt incomplete, as if what she saw was only a fragment of something larger, something she had never been permitted to fully recognize. What if I do not know how to change? She asked the question, quieter than before, but steadier, not as fear, but as acknowledgement of the unknown. He stepped closer, then not abruptly, not in a way that forced her attention, but in a way that altered the space between them until it felt intentional, until it felt chosen. You begin by not disappearing, he said simply, and though the words were few, they carried a weight that settled into her thoughts more deeply than anything else he had said. She remained still, her gaze fixed on the faint outline of herself in the glass, as she considered what that meant. Not disappearing, not correcting, not erasing, not stepping back. When space was not offered freely, it was a simple idea, and yet it felt impossibly difficult because it required her to do something she had never done before. Remain, not because she was required to, but because she chose to. She closed her eyes briefly, her breath steady as she allowed the thought to settle, and when she opened them again, her reflection had not changed, yet something within it had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, and for the first time she did not look away immediately. She did not retreat, she simply remained. And though it was a small act, almost invisible to anyone else, it felt like the beginning of something far greater, something that could not be undone, because once she had been seen, truly seen, she could no longer return to being unseen, even if she tried. The moment did not end when she chose to remain. It followed her beyond the west wing, into every corridor, every quiet space where she had once moved without thought, without presence. Elena walked through the house as she always had, her steps measured, her gaze lowered, yet something within her no longer aligned with the silence she had lived inside. It was not confidence, not yet, but it was no longer absence, it was awareness, and awareness changed everything. The servants noticed it, though they could not name it. A maid hesitated before stepping in front of her, as if uncertain whether to yield space. A footman paused when she entered a room, his movement stilled just long enough to acknowledge her before continuing. None of it was spoken, none of it was confirmed, yet it existed in the subtle shifts that filled the air, like something waiting to be understood. She did not respond to it, she did not encourage it, but she no longer erased it either. She allowed it to exist, just as she now allowed herself to do later. That evening, she entered the dining hall once more, the same room where the chair had first remained untouched. She did not look at it immediately. She did not need to. She already knew it would still be there, a quiet refusal against the order she had once restored. Without question, she moved toward the table, her hands steady, her expression composed. But when her gaze finally lifted, it did not retreat. The chair remained exactly as it had been, not corrected, not dismissed, a single detail that had changed the balance of everything. She paused beside it, her fingers brushing lightly against the carved wood, not to move it, not to fix it, but simply to acknowledge its presence. And in that moment, she understood it was never about the chair. It had been about choice, about leaving something as it was and allowing it to exist without correction, without justification. She drew a slow breath, the quiet around her no longer pressing against her, but settling beside her like something that no longer needed to be endured. You did not change it. His voice came from behind her, calm, steady. She did not turn immediately. She did not step away. She simply remained. Know your grace, she answered softly, and though her voice was quiet, it did not carry the same absence it once had. Why, he asked, and the question did not feel like a test. It felt like an invitation. She considered it for a moment, not searching for the expected answer, but for the truth, because it did not need to be. She said finally, and the words settled between them with a quiet certainty that surprised even her. He stepped closer, then not closing the distance entirely, but enough that she felt the shift of it, the presence of him, no longer something she avoided, but something she acknowledged. That is correct, he said, and there was something in his tone, something almost imperceptible yet unmistakable, approval, not of the act itself, but of the choice behind it. Elena lowered her gaze briefly, not in retreat, but in reflection, the weight of what had changed settling more clearly within her. She had not fixed the chair, she had not erased the difference, she had allowed it to remain, and in doing so, she had done the same for herself. The realization was quiet, but undeniable. She lifted her gaze again, not fully, not in defiance, but enough to meet his eyes for a brief moment. And this time, she did not look away immediately. The silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with something new, something that no longer required her to disappear. And as she stood there in the soft light of the dining hall with the untouched chair beside her and his presence steady at her back, she understood something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. She had spent years learning how to fade, but now she was learning something far more difficult: how to stay. The house did not return to what it had been, because once something unseen is acknowledged, it cannot be made invisible again. The change remained quiet, woven into the smallest details, into the way footsteps slowed instead of passing through her, into the way silence no longer erased her presence, but held it. Elena moved through the corridors as she always had, her hands steady, her posture composed, yet the difference was no longer something she carried alone. It existed around her in the space others now hesitated to cross. Without notice, it was not acceptance, not yet, but it was recognition, and recognition was the first thing she had never been given. She entered the West Wing again, not because she had been told to, but because she chose to. The room felt different this time, not unfamiliar, not uncertain, but open, as if it no longer required her to justify her presence. She stood near the window, once more the same place, where she had once waited without purpose, yet now the stillness felt different. It was no longer empty, it was hers. She did not fill it with movement, she did not search for something to correct, she simply remained, and in that quiet, she felt it fully. The shift that had begun the moment he chose to see her had taken root. He was there as she had come to expect, not announced, not imposing, but present. She did not lower her gaze immediately, she did not retreat. She acknowledged him with a small movement of her head, not as a servant responding to command, but as one presence recognizing another. You stayed, he said, his voice calm, but carrying a quiet weight that made the words more than observation. Yes, she answered softly, and the simplicity of it held more meaning than anything she had said before. He stepped closer, not closing the distance completely, but enough that the space between them felt intentional, chosen, as if it no longer separated them, but connected something unspoken within it. You understand now, he said, and though it was not a question, she answered it as one. I am beginning to, she replied, and the honesty in her voice did not waver. He studied her, then, not searching, not questioning, but acknowledging, as if what he had waited for had finally begun to take shape, and in that moment she understood something with a clarity that settled deeply within her. He had never forced her to change, he had only refused to let her remain unseen. The rest had been her choice. She turned her gaze toward the window, the light softer now, the edges of the world beyond it less defined. Yet for the first time, it did not feel distant, it felt possible. She had spent years believing that her place was fixed, that her existence was meant to be quiet, unnoticed, easily forgotten. But now she stood within that same house, within those same walls, and understood that place had never been given to her. It had been taken from her quietly, steadily, until nothing remained but absence, and now for the first time, she was taking it back, not loudly, not forcefully, but simply by remaining, by not stepping aside, by not erasing herself. When space was not offered freely, she drew a slow breath, the air steady within her lungs, the silence no longer something she disappeared into, but something she stood within. And as she turned slightly, her gaze meeting his, without hesitation, she did not look away. The moment held, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but certain, and in that certainty something settled between them, not spoken, not defined, but understood. He inclined his head just slightly, not as acknowledgement of status, but as recognition of something far more equal, something that did not require words to exist. And as the quiet returned once more, Elena Whitmore did not fade into it, she remained, and for the first time in her life, that was enough, because some lives are not meant to be saved from the world, they are meant to be seen within it, and once they are seen, they can never disappear again.